Our scripture text this morning comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. For the past few weeks, we've been journeying with the prophets Elijah and Elisha. When I'm away next week, Pastor Brady is going to be preaching, and he's going to return to another narrative story about Elisha. But I had chosen to, during the lectionary, during this time of the year, it begins to deal with the Old Testament character of Abraham. And so we're going to journey when I'm here over the next few weeks, when there's not Vacation Bible School Sunday. We're going to walk with Abram and Sarai and these Old Testament characters and narratives and stories and see what is here for us to learn from. And so, the call of Genesis, or the call of Abram or Abraham, begins in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. And if you are familiar with the book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters are often referred to as the primeval history. It's kind of big narratives, the creation, story of the flood, story of the Tower of Babel, lots that is there, all trying to answer, I believe, what is wrong with our world. Why is the world the way that it is? And each story gives an answer to that question. But here, as we journey in Genesis chapter 12, the focus kind of narrows, and I like to think like the first 11 chapters are like the opening of The Sound of Music, where you see the big Alps, right, and it's big, beautiful vistas and pictures, and then all of a sudden it narrows in on Julie Andrews dancing, in the field on the mountain. And here we're narrowing in on this one family, the family of Abram, here in Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and at that time the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negev. Lord, add a blessing to the reading of His Word. We're going to focus mostly on the first part of this passage, called the call and the promise. I would add the commission, my sermon title, if I can, this morning. Call and the promise. There is a story about a young farmer, and he's standing in his field and he's observing the cloud formation. And the clouds, he realized, they form the letters G, P, and C. And he thinks them a call from God. Go preach Christ. The young farmer rushes to the deacons of his church and he insists that he's been called to preach. Respectful of his enthusiasm, they invite him to fill the pulpit. Now that Sunday, the sermon is long. Hopefully this sermon won't. That sermon that Sunday was tedious. Hopefully this sermon won't. And it was virtually incoherent. Hope my sermon's not incoherent. And when it finally ended, the leaders sat in stunned silence. And finally a wizened deacon muttered to the would-be preacher. He said, "Seems to me the clouds were saying, go plant corn." Now, if there's a true story behind this old tale, it would not be the first time that there's been some confusion about what it means to be called by God, to be called into ministry. The concept of call or being called by God is one of the deepest biblical ideas. And at the same time, there's often misunderstanding around the concept of call. For example, have you ever considered or imagined what Abram's wife Sarai thought at that moment when Abram started packing up his belongings, having heard God's call to go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you? Biblical scholar Lewis Smedes imagines Sarai waking up about 4 in the morning, hearing the bustling noises of Abram packing, and she says to him, "What are you doing, Abe?" "Packing." "What for?" "Well, we're leaving." "Where are we going?" "I don't know." "Why are we going?" "Because he told me to." "Who's he?" "Didn't tell me." And you can imagine Sarai calling her father, "What am I going to do?" And the father says, "I knew you shouldn't have married that nut." And she responds to her father and says, "You don't even know the most of it." He says God's promised him land. "To your offspring I will give you this land." And blessing. Right? Abram said, God said, "I will bless you and make your name great." And then she tells her father, and Abram also said, we would have descendants. Dad, I had to remind Abram that he and I don't have any children. Right? In this imagined conversation, we encounter the reality of Abram and Sarai's world, right? God gave Abram all these promises of land and blessing and descendants, but the reality of the world is what? That before this, they were journeying with Abram's father, Terah, and there was an early death. Abram's brother, Lot's father, died. Haran had died. So it leaves behind an orphaned nephew. And Terah and his family had already started out on the land to Canaan, but they settled in the land of Haran. So there was an interrupted journey. And above all, right, in Genesis chapter 11:30, right before this call comes, we hear these words that Abram was married to Sarai, but Sarai was barren, had no. As we observe this contrast between God's promises and God's call, God's promises and the lived reality, we begin to feel the tension between call and the. We begin to realize that God is calling Abram not only to and for something, but God is calling him from something. God is calling Abram to leave the world of barrenness behind and to trust the promise. Now, this principle of leaving the barrenness behind, right? To leave the barrenness behind and to trust in the promise is illustrated in the story of this family, the Reese family. Tim and Stacy and their children. Tim and Stacy are from my hometown of Massillon, Ohio. They are endorsed missionaries with our international. And when I met them back in June of 2019, or I should say I actually kind of reconnected with them, because when I had dinner with Tim that evening at the mission banquet at the American Baptist Church Biennial, he reminded me that our paths had crossed as teenagers. I had completely forgotten. Well, over these past 3 years, they have been building their missionary partnership network, and this past month, they traveled to Costa Rica to begin language school in preparation for their ministry of discipleship and economic development in the Dominican Republic. During our dinner those few years ago, Tim shared with me how he came to understand God's call to be a. He shared with me how he had a well-paying marketing job, but that the job often left him feeling empty and barren. The challenge was, of course, that that job provided financial security for him and his family. But as he and Stacy felt God's call to serve as a missionary, they faced that same choice that Abram and Sarai faced. The choice between staying in safety or to leave and risk. Commentator Walter Brueggemann writes, "To stay in safety is to remain barren, but to leave and risk to have hope." And Tim chose to risk and have hope. When he was endorsed, with him and Stacy were endorsed to serve as missionaries, he said, "I've always sensed God's call in my life, But I always told God what I would do for God rather than allow God to do things through me. And as I've been stretched and grown over the years, I've learned that until I could entrust God with the gifts God's given me and give them back to God, I would always be putting God in a box sealed by my own abilities, goals. He said surrendering to the call meant breaking down the walls of that self-made box and surrendering all of me, every last part, so that God could use me, a living sacrifice, a workman approved for Christ's kingdom building and purpose, all. And so whether it's Tim and Stacy Reese, or Abram and Sarai, or me, or you, or Grace Baptist Church of Bluebell, God issues an invitation to move out of a life of barrenness and into a life of promise, blessing. Now let's observe a little further the relationship between the call and the promise to Abram. Notice the speech of God to Abram is short. It basically says, go. The New International Version translates it as leave. Leave your people. Leave your father's household. Leave the land that you know and go to the land I will show you. God's call is a call to let go, renounce, to relinquish, to depart from the presumed world of security. Now think about how difficult that is in today's world. A culture that says, you deserve this. You deserve this. And think about the call of Tim and Stacy to risk all of that. But the call to Abram and Sarah is not based on discipline or law, but it's based on the promises of God. It's based on all those promises that God gives to Abram. They're all those things we crave, well-being and security and prosperity. So when Abram hears God's call to go to the land I will show you, it's not the command to go that requires a decision. Rather, it's the promises of God that press the issue. In verses 2 and 3, you hear these promises. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. 5 promises. You might be wondering, last 2 tangent. This you have to have Bible study. But the promises require a decision. Will Abram believe God's promise? Will he believe in the promises and leave the barrenness behind? In his commentary, Brueggemann says, it is the crisis of deciding to live either for the promise, and so disengaging from the present barren way of things, or to live against the promise, holding on grimly to the present ordering of life. Think about that. In our lives, God has given us these promises. Yet the tension is that the present way that things are ordered is it's barren, challenging. And we look around us, and we have to decide if we're going to live for the promise or live against the promise. Right? Are we going to choose to trust in God's promises? The same thing happened in Jesus' life when he's preaching in the temple court. Right? And he's offering new life to the people of Israel. Every day he's preaching. But the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders on the people doing what? They were trying to kill him. They wanted to stay with the present barren ordering. But they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on. Some people welcomed. And so the promises press the issue. That's what is inviting us, calling us to make a decision. In these promises, God is saying to the landless couple, there's a future waiting for you. And God gifts a future to Abram and Sarai. He chooses them. He chooses his family and he elects them. And we might wonder, well, why Abram? According to the biblical text, he hadn't done anything noteworthy yet. But later, rabbis would fill in that gap with an extra biblical story that he had smashed all that he had smashed all the idols in his father's house. Right? That his father was an idol maker, and Abram was the first monotheist, and he smashed all the idols, and therefore he received this call. But the Bible doesn't offer such an explanation. Rather, his initial call is pure grace. All grace. There's nothing Abram had done to be given these promises. Rather, the future promise to Abram is pure gift. Pure gift. And we might think, well, that's not really fair or equal. We might be offended by that gift or that gift of grace. Why does God choose them, this one family, this one nation? It's not because Abraham has done anything.
Got to keep up the left side here.
It's not also for Abram's own sake. Rather, these promises are given and Abram is called for the sake of others. Right? I will bless you so that what? You all the families of the earth.
Just barely missed the bunker. Scheffler hit it in. It's the size of a bathing pool, really. Very small, but horrible place to be. He already missed
it. So he receives not only a call, not only promises, but also a commission. And Abram's family is invited to live with, for, and among other nations. And the call is to be a blessing, and that is repeated over and over and over and over throughout Genesis and throughout the Scriptures. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. I'll make your descendants numerous as the stars, and all the nations on the earth will be blessed. Out of the dust of the earth, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. The Scriptures foresaw that God, right? All nations will be blessed through you. That was the call, to be an alternative community that lived according to the principles of justice and servitude and mercy, that lived under the promises of God and modeled a way for other nations to receive a blessing from this same God, that all might come into a living relationship with Him. That was the call, Abram. And I don't know about you, but it sounds a lot like the mission of Christ's church. Right? To live in such a way that others might come into a living relationship with God. God of love, this God of mercy, this God of grace, who demonstrates that love for us on the cross of Calvary. Now, if you know the story of Abraham's family and of Israel, you know that they did not always embody that alternative community. Right? God's people may be tempted to turn inward, to turn away, to only be worried about their survival. And of course, that community of Israel fell into that temptation more than once. And it's easy for us to do this. But here in this story, we're reminded that when God calls us, when God gives us that pure gift of salvation, Jesus Christ, that God gives that gift not for our own sake, but for the sake of others. And we're called by God for the sake of others. We're invited to Him. In the passage, we hear how Abram accepted and embraced that call. He and Sarai went along with Lot and the rest of the family. They journeyed throughout the land of Canaan, even though what? Even though the Canaanites were already in the land. And when you read Hebrews, we realize that Abram continued to pursue that promise, even though he never fully...
Sorry if you get that the other way around, lobby lounge. And
what faith
we looked last Thursday at chapter 1, verse 1 to 4, the historicity of Jesus, the fact that Christianity is a historical religion. And so we're going to delve into that a little bit more this coming Thursday, Lord willing. And so those are the announcements that we have this morning that are pertinent to our religious aspects of here at Greenhouse Estates. And we are going to begin our service this morning with our first hymn. It's number 210. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty.
Question this morning that I leave us with: will we honor that call? Will we say yes to God's call? we say yes to God's will? Will we decide to trust in God's will? Will we live God's commission to bless others? Call, promise. Lord, there are days when we simply are not sure what the next step may be in life or in our relationship with you. On those days, O Lord, we pray that you would grant us ears to hear and eyes to see, and willing hearts, O Lord, to trust in your promises and in your goodness, that we would live out your commission and your call to be a people called out. As 2 Peter puts it, a royal priesthood, people called to belong to God, make your love real in this world. However we can do that on a daily basis, oh God, we pray that you reveal that to us. Whether it's through our summer mission projects, during our own time, or whether it's as a community of faith together, we ask that you feel your call, that we would Our response in this morning is standing on the promises of God. That is number 271 in the blue hymnal.